The first time my neighbor warned me that someone had been inside my house, I thanked him for protecting me. The second time, he told me exactly what the intruder had touched. The third time, I realized something that still makes it difficult for me to sleep with the curtains open. He wasn't warning me about someone getting into my house. He was telling me what he had done inside it. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I had lived alone for less than 6 months when I learned that the most dangerous person in my life wasn't a stranger watching my house from the street. It was the man who lived next door. I moved into the house in October. It was an ordinary little property on a quiet row of houses at the edge of town. Nothing about the place stood out. The neighbors kept to themselves. The roads were usually empty after dark, and most evenings were nothing more than rain against the windows and the sound of the heating coming on. I worked from home, so I spent a lot of time there. That was probably the first thing Martin learned about me. I met him on my second evening. There was a knock at the door just after 11. When I opened it, I found an older man standing beneath my porch light with an umbrella in his hand. He was probably in his late 50s, neatly dressed, completely calm. He smiled. "Sorry to bother you. I'm Martin. I live next door." I introduced myself. He glanced toward my downstairs window. "Your window is slightly open." I looked behind me. He was right. I had forgotten to close it. Martin smiled again. "Just thought I'd mention it. This street is quiet, but you can never be too careful." At the time, I thought it was kind. Now I understand that he was learning whether I would listen to him. A few days later, he warned me that my front door sometimes failed to latch properly. A week after that, he mentioned that my back gate made a loud noise when the wind pushed against it. Then he started doing small favors. He brought my bins in when it rained. He told me when a delivery had been left outside. Once, he knocked on my door because he had noticed I had left my downstairs light on while I was away. I began to think I had been lucky with my neighbor. Then, one Tuesday evening, I came home and noticed the back door was open. Not wide, just enough to notice. I stood in the hallway staring at it. I was certain I had locked it before leaving. I checked the lock. There was no damage. Nothing appeared to be missing. I called the police. While I was waiting, Martin appeared at the fence. He looked at the open door. Then he looked at me. "Don't go inside." There was something about the certainty in his voice that made me stop. If someone has been inside, they could still be there. The police arrived a few minutes later and searched the house. They found nothing. No broken windows. No damaged locks. No missing property. Eventually, one of the officers suggested that the door might not have closed properly. It was embarrassing. I felt foolish for calling them. Before leaving, the officer told me to keep everything locked. I thanked him. Martin waited until the police had gone. Then he came over. "There is something I should have told you." I looked at him. "What?" He lowered his voice. "I saw a man near your kitchen window last night." My stomach tightened. "What man?" "Dark jacket. Baseball cap." "When?" "Just after 11. Why didn't you call the police?" He shrugged. I wasn't sure what I was looking at. Then he smiled. "Don't worry. I'll keep an eye out." That sentence stayed with me, because from that night onward, I started noticing things I had never noticed before. A car parked across the road for too long. Footsteps outside after midnight. The feeling that somebody had been standing near the house when I wasn't looking. And every time I mentioned something to Martin, he already seemed to know about it. One evening, I asked him if he had seen anyone outside again. He shook his head. "No." Then he looked toward my front window. "But if I do, I'll tell you." I installed a security camera the following weekend. Martin noticed it almost immediately. He stood beside the fence looking up at it. "Good idea," he said. I laughed. I figured I should know who's coming near the house. Martin looked at the camera for several seconds. Then he smiled. "Absolutely." That night, at 2:17 in the morning, my phone vibrated. Motion detected. I opened the camera feed. A man was standing outside my house. Dark jacket. Baseball cap. He wasn't walking past. He was standing completely still, looking directly at my front door. I called the police. By the time they arrived, the street was empty. One officer watched the recording. Then he asked me something strange. "Do you know the man next door?" I said yes. Why? The officer rewound the footage. He pointed toward the upstairs window of Martin's house. A curtain was slightly open. Martin was standing behind it, watching the man outside my house. The officer looked at me. Does he normally watch the street at this time of night? I didn't know what to say. The next morning, Martin knocked on my door. I didn't answer. He knocked again. Daniel. I stayed silent. After a few seconds, he said something that made my blood run cold. I know you're home. I hadn't told him I was. I had been standing completely still in the hallway. He waited. Then he walked away. That was the first time I became afraid of him. Not suspicious. Afraid. I stopped speaking to Martin after that. I also started checking the house every morning before I began work. Windows, doors, locks. Nothing looked wrong. Then, one morning, I noticed my bedroom curtains were open. I always closed them before going to sleep. I was certain of it. I checked the camera. Nothing. There was no footage of anyone entering. I assumed I had forgotten. 2 days later, it happened again. This time, one of my kitchen chairs had been moved. Only slightly. I stared at it for several minutes. I couldn't prove anything, but I knew I hadn't moved it. I called the police again. They advised me to change the locks. I did. That evening, Martin knocked on my door. I didn't open it. He spoke through the door. I heard you change the locks. I froze. There was no reason he should have known that. I hadn't told him. I waited until he left. Then I called the locksmith who had installed them. I asked whether anyone else had requested information about my locks. He said no. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. Instead, I started wondering how Martin knew. 3 days later, I found something behind my bedroom radiator. It was a tiny black plastic object. At first, I thought it was a piece of rubbish. Then I realized it was an old wireless sensor. I photographed it and took it to the police. They couldn't immediately tell me what it had been used for, but they told me something else. The device wasn't part of my current security system. It had been installed before I moved in. That was the first real clue. I contacted the property management company. I asked when the house had last been inspected before I moved in. They gave me a date. It was 11 days before I signed the tenancy agreement. I asked who had attended the inspection. They gave me the name of a contractor. I contacted him. He remembered the property. He also remembered the man who had given him access. Do you remember what he looked like? I asked. The contractor laughed softly. Not really. Then he paused. Actually, yes. My heart started beating faster. Why? Because he told me he was the owner. I asked for a description. The contractor described Martin. I hung up. For the first time, I stopped asking myself whether Martin knew too much. I started asking how much he knew. The police began investigating. They checked the property records. Martin wasn't the registered owner. But that wasn't the strangest part. The house had previously belonged to a company that had been dissolved several years earlier. Martin had been connected to that company, not as the owner, as a director. And according to the records, he had handled several properties before the company disappeared, including mine. The police searched Martin's house. They found a key ring containing several keys. One of them opened my old back door. They found photographs, hundreds of them. My house, my car, my bedroom window, my kitchen, the front door. Some photographs had been taken from across the street. Others had been taken from inside. There were photographs of me sitting at my desk, me eating dinner, me asleep. But what disturbed me most was how organized everything was. The photographs weren't random. They were labeled with dates and times. My work schedule had been written down. My usual shopping days. The time I left for the gym. The time I came home. Even the days when I worked from a cafe instead of my house. Martin hadn't been watching my house. He had been studying me. The police also discovered something about the man in the baseball cap. He was Martin's younger brother. The two men had been working together. They had staged the sightings. They had left the back door open. They had moved small objects inside my house. They had created just enough evidence to make me believe somebody was watching me. And every time I became frightened, Martin appeared to protect me. He wasn't solving the problem. He was creating it. Then the police found the part that explained everything. Before I had moved into that house, Martin had already been watching me. Not there. Somewhere else. They found photographs of me leaving my previous workplace. Photographs of me walking to my car. Photographs of the street where I used to live. One photograph showed me carrying boxes into my old apartment. It had been taken 3 months before I ever saw the house I eventually rented from him. I asked the detective why Martin had chosen me. He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "We're still trying to establish that." 2 days later, Martin was charged. I thought it was over. I changed my phone number. I moved to another town. I didn't tell my friends where I was going. I didn't tell my new landlord where I had lived before. I didn't post photographs online. For 6 months, nothing happened. I slowly started sleeping normally again. I stopped checking the windows every few minutes. I even began leaving the curtains open during the day. Then, one Friday morning, I found an envelope on my doorstep. There was no stamp, no return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed the front of my new house, taken from across the road. I stared at it for a long time. Then I turned it over. There were 6 words written on the back. "You really should change your curtains." I called the police. They asked when I had moved into the house. I told them. They asked who knew my new address. I gave them the names. They checked. Nobody had shared it. The photograph had been taken after I moved in. There was no question about that. The detective came to my house. He looked at the photograph. Then he looked through my front window. "Daniel," he said quietly, "where did you buy these curtains?" I told him. He stared at me. Then he turned the photograph around and pointed to the bedroom window. The curtains in the photograph were the same curtains hanging in my bedroom, but I had bought them after moving there. I had never owned them before, which meant whoever took that photograph had been watching my new house after I put them up. The police never found out who took it. Martin denied everything. His brother refused to speak. And although investigators found enough evidence to connect Martin to my old house, they couldn't prove he had taken the photograph from my new street. So officially, the investigation remains open. But there is one detail I have never told the police. The night before I found that photograph, I woke up at 2:17 in the morning. I heard a sound outside my bedroom window. Just one quiet click. I opened my eyes. The curtains were closed. I didn't move. I listened. Nothing. Then I heard another click. Closer this time. I reached for my phone. Before I could turn on the screen, I noticed something through the gap between the curtains. A small red light. The kind you see on a security camera. It disappeared almost immediately. I never opened the curtains. I never looked outside. I called the police from my bed and waited until they arrived. They searched the garden. They searched the street. They found nothing. But before they left, one officer noticed something near the window. A tiny piece of black plastic. The same kind of device they had found behind my radiator months earlier. I haven't slept with the curtains open since. And every night, before I go to bed, I check the locks. Then I check the windows. Then I close the curtains. And sometimes, when I stand there in the dark, looking at the glass, I catch myself wondering what scares me more. The thought that someone might be standing outside, or the possibility that they already know I'm looking.